Good evening, everyone, or good afternoon to all participants from across the country. My name is Karen Mock, and I'm honored to serve as the president of JSpaceCanada, which, as most of you are aware, is a completely grassroots volunteer organization dedicated to raising the voices and, dare I say, the influence of progressive Zionists in Canada. On behalf of the board of JSpaceCanada, welcome to what promises to be a very stimulating session. We are so pleased to be hosting the Canadian launch of Rabbi Lawrence Englander's latest book, The Prince of Healers, and especially pleased to partner with Solel congregation in Mississauga. Welcome to our co-hosts. We'll function as bookends, so to speak, with me kicking things off and with Arliene Botnick, give a wave, Arliene, Solel's Director of Education, facilitating the Q&A, and Rabbi Audrey Pollack, welcome Audrey, so good to be with you, who is the Rabbi of Solel, giving the closing remarks. Welcome and thank you, Audrey and Arliene, and a special welcome to the members of Solel, as well as the interfaith community in Peel, who are also tuning in this evening. Just a brief note on the technical aspects. The chat has been disabled, but please post any questions you have in the Q&A, which will be seen by the panelists, with Arliene monitoring them and leading the discussion later. And as we begin, I want to acknowledge that I am connecting with you, so there's a little bit of a delay, from the traditional Algonquin territory, as per the Anishinaabe, Ojibwe, Chippewa, and Algonquin peoples named in the Williams Treaty of 1923. I know that those of you from across the country acknowledge the various Aboriginal peoples who came before you. As settlers, we recognize the contributions and historic importance of Indigenous people, and that we must be clearly and overtly committed to making the promise and challenge of truth and reconciliation real in our communities. Now, without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce our special guest author for this evening, Rabbi Lawrence A. Englander, affectionately known by most of us as Larry, who is the founding rabbi of Solel congregation, serving there since its inception in 1993, 73, until his retirement in 2014. Now, Larry serves as Solel's Rabbi Emeritus and is also adjunct rabbi at Temple Sinai in Toronto. Rabbi Englander received his doctorate of Hebrew letters from Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion, in the field of Jewish mysticism and rabbinics. He has taught at York University in Toronto and at Leo Beck College in London, England. He has written several articles on Jewish mysticism, as well as a book, The Mystical Study of Ruth, published by Scholars Press. He is the former editor of the Central Conference of American Rabbis Journal. Another passion, as most of you know, of Rabbi Englander's is liberal Zionism, a subject on which he has written and edited several articles. He's headed Arts of Canada and been on their board for many years and served as chair of Artsenu, a worldwide progressive Zionist organization from 2014 to 2017. He is co-editor with Rabbi Stanley Davids of the book Fragile Dialogue, New Voices in Liberal Zionism, published by the CCAR Press, and that many JSpace members have studied with Rabbi Englander. He is also on the International Council of the New Israel Fund, and I'm proud to say he also served on the board of JSpaceCanada for several years and continues to serve on our advisory council. Active in intercultural and interfaith dialogue and humanitarian work throughout his rabbinate, in 2005, Larry was appointed as a member of the Order of Canada for his work in the community. Larry, we're honored that JSpaceCanada is hosting the Canadian launch of your new novel, The Prince of Healers. And don't feel shy about later posting the way people can order it if they haven't already. And now, it also gives me great pleasure to introduce you to our special guest moderator, Jenny Isaacs. Most of you active with JSpaceCanada would know Jenny fondly as the dynamic director of Hashomer Hatzayir's Heart to Heart program that brings Jewish and Palestinian teenagers from Israel to Camp Shomriah in Canada for a youth leadership development program. Jenny leads them in strategies to build the relationships conducive to building a shared society. And I've been thrilled to work with Jenny since practically the inception of the Heart to Heart program. But less known to many of you would be her outstanding Jewish educational pursuits that are very relevant to this event this evening. Jenny holds a BA from the University of Toronto in Diaspora and Transnational Studies and a Master's of Teaching from OISE, the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education. Jenny is passionate about education and its transformative potential. She is particularly interested in the intersections of identity, education, and social change. She is co-founder of BASE, a pluralistic Beit Midrash for 20 and 30-somethings of diverse Jewish backgrounds, which, since the fall of 2018, runs programming as part of a larger partnership initiative called Lishma. In addition to organizing learning opportunities for others, Jenny is herself an avid student of Jewish texts of all kinds. After finishing a year of reading Parshat Shavua with her Chavruta, they decided to continue a weekly learning and are now midway through Samuel 2 and excited to see what comes next. And Jenny, we're excited to see what comes next for you too. Ladies and gentlemen, the three of us will see you later as we turn our program over to Jenny and Larry in conversation on the Prince of Healers. Take it away, Jenny.
Thanks, Karen. Thank you for the warm welcome. And Rabbi, I'm excited to be in conversation with you.
Hi, Jenny.
So
same here.
So as Karen mentioned, one of the Jewish educational pursuits that I'm involved with is formerly BASE, now Lishma, and you and I had a chance to learn together at BASE
Yes.
when you came and taught a course for us several years back, which was a wonderful opportunity. And I have to say, and this is part of my lens going into this conversation, that I grew up very Jewishly engaged, but not so literate when it came to traditional religious texts. So as Karen mentioned, I just completed my first cycle through the Parshat Shavua, the weekly reading of the Torah, and I'm now continuing on through the Tanakh. And so one thing that's really interesting for me and interesting about your book is thinking about, people who may not have read the works of Maimonides himself having an entry point into his work and into, who this famous character is. So I just wanted to also sort of say thank you for putting this out into the world, because I think it's really helpful for people who want that those different kinds of entry points. And I can see by your bookshelf that you like books. And I know you've written more than just this one, but I wanted to ask, to get the conversation started, of all the books you might have written, why this one? Why did you feel like this book should be put out into the world?
Yeah, all right, fair question. I guess it came as a series of knocks on the head as to why this particular book. And I guess I can show you rather than just talk about it. So here is the man himself. This is a statue of Maimonides that's outside the synagogue in Cordoba, Spain, which of course is where he initially grew up. I don't think anybody really knows what he looked like, but this is the most famous statue of him or likeness. The first motivation to write about him came from a speech that Cynthia Ozick gave to the Learned Society of America. Now, Ozick just turned 90, but I've deliberately chosen a younger picture because this goes back decades. I can't even remember how long ago. I think it was in Moment magazine, where she was invited to address the Learned Society of America, which of course is quite an honor. And she came to the pulpit and she looked out at them and she said, "You folks call yourselves learned. Have you ever heard of Rabbi Akiva? Have you ever read the writings of Moses Maimonides?" And even back then, I thought, she's right. Is there any way that Moses Maimonides could become more of a household name and become better known? And so that was one motivation to write this story. That kind of marinated for a while. And then the other motivation was that in his time, in the 12th century, he was very open to interfaith dialogue, where most people weren't. And of course, in his world, it was mainly Jews, Christians, and Muslims. And he really tried to build bridges between them. We'll get more into that a little bit later on, but that was a real innovation of his. Then in 1994, there was a conference of rabbis and cantors that went from North America to Fez for a conference on Maimonides. And while the conference was going on, we had time to tour the area, etc. And this is a picture of the souk, the bazaar in Fez. You can tell it's absolutely magical and spellbinding. And there's a passage in my book where Maimonides is actually jostled around all these pots and pans and tapestries that are hanging everywhere. Now, what we learned in this conference is that we know that Maimonides and his family had to flee from Spain when he was 13 years of age because of persecution by a fundamentalist group of Muslims known as the Almohads that had invaded Cordoba and were imposing very strict Islamic rule. It was the Quran or the sword. So they decided to flee. And there's about a 9-year gap, maybe a little bit more, where it's not known where he went. But he does land up in Fez after that period. So I thought that was kind of grist for the fiction writer's mill as to where he was and what he could have done. So part of our tour also went to Marrakesh, and there was a souk in Marrakesh as well. And I actually went there at night and saw all this lit up. We saw snake charmers and all kinds of stuff. It was really attractive. And then in the stalls, they had these spices piled up in pyramids that were just absolutely enticing. So I figured, okay, if I'm going to write a story about Maimonides, he's got to spend some time in Marrakesh. And in the book he does. But in real life, who knows? Anyway, we'll get back to that one later. So that's basically some of the motivation that caused me to want to write about him, and mainly just so that he would become better known.
Yeah, I love that. And I love sort of the pulling on your own experiences and trying to imagine Maimonides into that situation or into that place and sort of, fill in those blanks. So for those of us for whom Maimonides is not yet a household name or someone that we're as familiar with, let's say this was going to be someone's first encounter with Maimonides, what do they need to know going into the book so that they don't end up spreading lots of rumors? Which is to say, can you just give us in broad strokes which characters and events in the book are, real events and which are fictitious, or maybe they're real, but we don't know that. So give me a bit of a walkthrough of fact versus fiction in this book.
Sure. Maimonides and his family are certainly real. That means he himself, his father, Maimon, was a real person and a rabbi. He had a younger brother, David. Eventually, he had a son, Abraham, who is also in the book. From the Muslim side, Saladin is certainly real, as is the Islamic philosopher Muhammad ibn Rushd. We know him in the West as Averroes, but his Arabic name would be Ibn Rushd. They think it's possible that the two of them may have met, because both of them did grow up in Cordoba. Ibn Rushd was maybe 8 or 9 years older than Moses. But certainly they didn't strike up the friendship that occurs in the book. So that part was fictitious, but they were certainly of like mind in many areas of their philosophy. The other real person is Saladin's vizier, Al-Fadl, who plays a very significant role in Moses' life. Now, Al-Fadl was Saladin's vizier in Cairo. Saladin, of course, was a sultan, and he traveled all over the place, but he added so much territory to his empire. So Al-Fadl kind of kept the home fires burning in Cairo. And it is a fact that Maimonides was appointed by him and by Saladin as the chief surgeon of the palace. So that part is true. So
okay, then what's not true?
Yeah, okay. Well, I just want to say, think of all this stuff that Moses Maimonides was. He was a scholar. He was a rabbi. He was a physician. He was a legalist, all wrapped up into one. I mean, there's an overachiever par excellence, right? In terms of what's fictitious, his brother-in-law, Uzziel, he actually did have a brother-in-law by that name, but his personality is purely my invention. Several of the other personalities, like Abdullah, is a fictitious character, and other people that he bumps into as he goes along. Apparently, Zuta, the rabbi in Cairo, there was apparently a rabbi by that name, but we don't really know anything about his personality. The word Zuta in Aramaic means shorty. So I had to picture him as a short guy with pointy toes, always standing up on them. I just thought it went with his name. So there you go.
Amazing. And this might be a bit of a curveball question, but I'm just sort of, as you were talking, thinking, can you take us inside your own mind and your own journey writing this book? Did you kind of go into it with a plan and like all the characters that you knew you wanted to be part of it? Or as you were writing, did some of them just sort of emerge for you as like, okay, we've got to bring someone in here? I'm just sort of curious about your process.
Yeah, I've read what other fiction authors have to say, and I think it's fairly common that characters just kind of grow as you write the story in two ways. One way is that I start with a character, and then that character is completely transformed into something else by the time we're finished. And then other characters just emerge out of the blue as the story goes on. So I think there's a little bit of both.
Cool, thanks. So tonight's event is organized by JSpace and Solel, and I understand that it's very likely that many of our viewers today connect to both of those organizations through their connection with Israel. And so I'm just wondering, what does the book, this is a bit of a two-parter, but maybe I'll just start with the first part of my question. What might the book have to offer an audience that's particularly interested in or invested in Israel?
Okay, obviously it takes place in the 12th century, so it's way before Israel became a Jewish state. By the way, I know there are several members here from Temple Sinai, and as a congregation, they are very, very dedicated to Zionism as well. So welcome to you folks too. So I want to read a passage from the book where this is an actual historical event where up until the year 1187, Jerusalem and much of the Holy Land, much of Israel, was ruled by the Crusader Christians until Saladin came along and conquered much of it for Islam. And in 1187, he actually invaded the city of Jerusalem and conquered that for his empire as well. The fictitious part of it is that he asked Moses to tag along with him, all right? So Moses actually happens to be in Jerusalem after the conquest, excuse me, as the Crusader Knights are kind of wrapping up, ready to leave. And he befriends one Christian, please, excuse me just a sec.
Absolutely excused.
Sorry, he befriends a Hospitaller Knight by the name of Balian. Many of the Crusader Knights aren't very friendly folks, but Balian is. He's a real gentleman. And Maimonides says to him, I really want to see the Jewish quarter. And of course, you know where he wants to go. And Balian offers to escort him. So here's the story. Balian offered to escort Moses, and together they circled round to the southwest of the city. Moses wanted to enter Jerusalem through the gate of the Jewish quarter to retrace the path of countless generations of Jewish pilgrims on their way to the temple. The uneven trek through stone and rubble was effortless for Moses, as if he were drawn forward by some magnetic force. As they drew closer, he heard the beating of drums. People were cheering inside the gate. Moses almost pushed Balian over in his haste to enter the sacred ground. He was not prepared for what he saw. The drum beats came from minstrels assembled in front of a tavern, providing background music for a troupe of jugglers. A larger crowd had gathered in the public square between the tavern and the gate. Surrounded by a cheering crowd, two drunken peasants were engaged in a fist fight. Both were bruised and bleeding. Their tunics hung in shreds from their shoulders. The passion of the fight had long left them, but still they staggered on, swinging and kicking at each other. Moses smelled a repulsive odor that seemed to come from a foamy liquid in the spectators' metal tankards. As they gulped a mouthful in salute to a good punch, a considerable amount of this foul substance spilled onto the flagstones. A few knights stood in the back of the ring. Instead of breaking up the fight, they simply leaned on their spears and snorted in amusement. Balian gently grasped Moses' arm. I am sorry that you have to see us at our worst. Please, come with me. They walked along a broad avenue where Hospitaller Knights were in the process of surrendering their sentry posts to Muslim soldiers. In the meantime, daily life went on. Men and women carrying baskets of dates and pomegranates, glazed ceramic bowls and brightly colored cloth, chatted with each other and meandered into the shops on either side of the street. Barefoot beggars clad in soiled rags passed by and pleaded for alms through toothless mouths. A line of monks in brown sackcloth robes tied with rope at the waist weaved through the crowd. Balian and Moses followed them until they reached a huge building that seemed to be divided into sections, each with a roof of different height. In the middle rose a wide dome of black metal bearing a massive black cross. This church, Balian said, marks the burial place of Lord Jesus. It is the holiest site for us in Jerusalem. We had to take this roundabout route to avoid parts of the city that still lie in rubble. Your holy place is very close now. Moses' curiosity about this night had been mounting as they walked. I can't help but wonder, he said at last to Balian. You are clearly an educated man. You probably could have been a merchant or artisan or a host of other professions. Why did you choose to spend your life at war? Balian smiled, but his eyes were serious. Actually, Rabbi, my order is dedicated to healing the sick and the wounded. We only fight when necessary. Then you could have become a doctor. Well, the Hospitallers offer me yet another reward, Balian replied. If I do what I can to ease suffering in this world, I pray that in heaven I may stand guard over Lord Jesus himself. With his ultimate return, he will create a world that is free from bloodshed and hatred. Moses paused in thought. This knight's faith was strange to him, yet he held the same hopes of healing and peace. It was a simple faith to Moses, yet one to be admired. By this time, the men had veered off the wide street into a side alley. After a few twists and turns, they entered a courtyard surrounded by houses. In the midst of a bustling city, this courtyard was empty. Since the time he had entered Jerusalem, Moses had not seen a single Jew. At the far end of the courtyard stood a wall built of massive stones. This is what you came to see, said Balaam. Moses walked forward in slow, reverent paces toward the sole remnants of the Holy Temple's western wall. When he came face to face with the wall, he placed his fingertips lightly upon the stones, as if caressing precious gems. Moses wondered if it was the intensity of the sun's heat, or was it an aura emanating from the wall just handbreadths from his face? Whatever the cause, the rows of ashlars began to shimmer and, like a Torah scroll, unfurled their story. One stone became an altar, cradling a boy tethered to its surface. Over him stood the boy's father, grasping the slaughtering knife in his trembling hand. The knife plunged downward through generations into the wholesome flesh of a ram. Red-hot coals slid from gilded fire pans onto sacrificial wood beneath the carcass. Levitical chants harmonized with hissing entrails, raising the savor heavenward. Veiled by the smoke, kings and prophets exchanged recriminations, vying for the loyalty of a fickle people. Their voices softened and blended into the cadenced chant of rabbinic sages, tracing with a silver pointer the words of scripture illuminated by candlelight. A percussion clash of weapons drowned out the rabbi's chant. Blades of Roman fasces hacked at the candles and scattered them into sparks, which ignited and consumed the parchment. From the still glowing embers, a golden dome adorned with a crescent moon like a scimitar pushed its way through to rise victoriously toward heaven. A pair of heavy iron shields surrounded the crescent and halted its ascent, gripped it like a vice, and ripped it from its golden throne. A cruciform broadsword emerged from the shields and planted itself upon the scar of the dome. All grew still. The giant stones ceased their trembling. Moses rested his forehead on their chiseled surface. He began to walk backward like a courtier taking leave of a monarch, savoring one last look at the royal presence. Balaam came to meet him. Moses was grateful that the knight respected his mood of silence. As the two men walked together, Moses turned around to take in the wall, cross, and dome in a single view. If buildings compete to gain dominance upon this ground, he thought, what hope is there for their inhabitants to live together in peace?
One thing you might not know about me is that I got really into a podcast called Harry Potter and the Sacred Text.
Oh, yes.
Which is going to seem like a total non sequitur, but one of the wonderful things about this podcast is that they use a variety of different sort of sacred reading practices, one of which that I got introduced to is sacred imagination, where you try to imagine yourself into the story. And I feel like I didn't even have to try that hard. I just felt like I was there. And I don't know if you can hear this, but there's someone in my neighborhood playing drums. And you talked about the drum beats and then the percussive clash. And I really felt myself in the story and, you know, experiencing the sights and smells and feelings. And yeah, so thank you for the trip. I haven't been able to travel for a while, but
Well,
no,
thank you. That's wonderful. You just said, and what was in your imagination? That was beautiful.
So you ended on this note of, this question of will they be able to live together in peace? And I think that, we might be thinking about different things these days when we ask that question, but and especially with everything going on recently, thinking about Jerusalem and this question of will they be able to live together in peace is that, maybe an eternal one, but also a very timely one today. And I'm wondering, for those of us who are maybe particularly interested in the role of interfaith and intercultural relationships as a strategy for advancing peace and a positive, just future in Israel and the world over, but let's focus in on Israel. What do you think we can learn from Maimonides on this, and what did you really want us to get from the book? What keys or clues might we be able to find in the book on this?
I think this is one of the reasons that Maimonides is still widely read today and still considered to be one of the greatest, perhaps the greatest Jewish thinker of all time. Where he starts is he says that the world was created by God and that God gave us many gifts. And the supreme gift that he gave to humanity, which we alone have among all living beings, is the gift of the soul. And when Maimonides uses the word soul, I think he means what we would think of as the intellect. And so since all human beings have this intellect, all of us are able, through reasoning, to arrive at divine truths and to understand them. And it doesn't matter what religion you belong to. So to Maimonides, he wasn't eager in converting everybody to Judaism. That was completely unnecessary. That Jews and Muslims and Christians all held this common ground, that we worshiped the same God, that we acknowledged this gift of the soul, of the intellect that God gave us, and that all of our individual practices of our religions are, the ceremonial practices, the rituals, what have you, are ways in which each religious tradition expresses those beliefs or acts them out, if you wish. But when you really put them all together, all of those practices are really aiming towards the same summit. And that summit is what he called the intellectual love of God. It's a very ambitious journey that he presents to us. And yet I think it's one worth pursuing. And the further we climb toward it, I think the more and more, not just tolerant we become of other religions and traditions, but the more respectful we become and the more we learn from each other. And that, I think, is the legacy that Maimonides gives to us.
Yeah, and even it takes me back to one of the sentences in the passage that you wrote, where Balian says, this is, I'm going to misquote you, but you can correct me.
Okay.
Like, this is our holiest place and yes, yours is over there, kind of thing. And really just that non-judgmental, like, ours is better, yours is worse, like, just this is ours, that's yours. And they all, are what they are. I think that's even in that small interaction, I sort of got a taste of that.
And even the buildings kind of give you that possibility. I remember it was kind of early nighttime. So there was just a little bit of light left in the sky. And I was in the old city, you probably know it, at the top of that staircase where you're kind of looking down at the Western Wall from above. Mm-hmm. And in that view, I saw the Western Wall, which of course is holy to Jews. I saw the dome of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which Balian mentioned is holy to Christians, and I saw the minaret of a mosque. And in that dusk background, they were all coexisting very quietly and very peacefully. And the thought occurred to me at the time, oh, that we humans could accomplish the same thing. So I think it's possible. We just have to work harder at it. And by the way, it wasn't just Maimonides. This goes back to Ibn Rushd as well, that in his actual writings, he talks about this gift of the intellect and our common humanity as well. And then about a century or so later, Thomas Aquinas, in the Christian tradition, picks up the same theme. Apparently, when Aquinas wrote his systematic theology, he had Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed open on his desk. So those are the three amigos, all right, that really pursue this line of thinking.
Yeah. So I want to make sure that we leave time for questions. So in just a moment, I'm going to invite Arliene back on to take us through some of the questions. And for everyone listening, now is a great time to start writing them in the Q&A if you'd like. But I just have one more that I want to quickly ask you. So Maimonides, as you mentioned, is a prolific scholar in many, you know, an overachiever, you said, and a prolific scholar in many domains. I'm curious, let's say I read your book and I'm like, oh my gosh, Maimonides, this is my new obsession. I just want to get into Maimonides. I want some first source, you know, some primary sources. And I'm thinking about these moral questions and sort of what Maimonides can offer me in terms of how to live in today's world. Where do you recommend that I start? I know it's like a really small question, but if I want Maimonides' best guidance on how to live in the world today, solve today's problems, where do you suggest I begin?
There's a professor at Northwestern University in Chicago, Kenneth Seeskin, who wrote a book, I think it's called A Guide for the Perplexed of Our Time. And he tries to update Maimonides. I heard him lecture, and he said, could you imagine Moses Maimonides at one of our Jewish summer camps, where he'd be sitting in, you know, on the ground with cross-legged, with short pants on the grass, with a soiled sweatshirt, and some song leaders jumping around, singing all these great campy songs. And Seeskin said, little Moses would have a look of sour contempt on his face, right? Like, how common, you know? So he certainly was an elitist, but I think Seeskin's book is good. There are other books that claim to have cracked the code of the Guide for the Perplexed, which is stymied scholars for centuries, and I think still does. I read one of them by James Diamond, and I thought, wow, he's done it. He's really explained the Guide for the Perplexed. When I put it down, my wife Cheryl said, so how did he do that? I couldn't explain it all. It had just gone, right? So you can try, but it's it takes work.
Thank you. And if I wanted to just last thing I'm going to push, and then Arliene, I promise I'll turn it over to you. If I wanted to read the Guide to Perplex myself, like really get in there on that primary source, how should I prepare myself? Asking for a friend. I'm still midway through Tuvim. No, Nevi'im.
What I would suggest, if you pick it up and try to read it cover to cover, you'll go crazy. But there's a book by Alfred Ivry, I-V-R-Y, an American scholar. It's simply called Moses Maimonides. And he kind of gives you a chapter by chapter summary of the Guide for the Perplexed, along with his own critique. And I would suggest that's a really good book to take a look at. If you want a biography, there's many, but I think one of the more recent ones, and to me the best one, is by Joel Kramer, Kraemer, once again called Moses Maimonides. I know that somebody in this webinar today has already picked it up and started reading that.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. And yeah, I think it's, you know, there are so many different kinds of writings to read, and it's important not to try to read a recipe book the way you try to read a novel, the way you try to read, you know, Torah, philosophy, whatever. So it's helpful to kind of get a sense of different options and how to approach them. So thank you so much for the lovely conversation and for giving us an intro to the book and a little bit of the backstory. And I will be quiet now and turn it over to you, Arliene, to help guide us through the Q&A. So
thank you, Jamie, for your wonderful questions and for guiding the conversation so expertly. Thank you.
Always a pleasure.
Okay, and thank you again, Jenny. First of all, one of the questions answered, someone wants to know how many participants. So there's well over 100 participants to Rabbi Englander's honor. And again, welcome again to all Solel and Temple Sinai. And thank you, Rabbi, for acknowledging them. They felt a little left out initially. One of the first questions was, all the letters, are they original? How many of the letters documented?
Yeah, the letters from Ibn Rushd to Moses are fictitious. I made those up. The letters that Maimonides wrote, I think basically all of them are factual. For example, his response to the Jews of Cordoba in how to weather, this oppressive regime, he did write that. He wrote the responsum for the synagogue about the repetition of the Amidah prayer and how it created a whole bunch of conversation and noise, and so it should be eliminated. He did write that. And he also, the most important, I think, is his treatise on the resurrection of the dead, which of course is a traditional rabbinic view. And the way he writes that responsum, you really wonder what he's getting at, and his brother-in-law Uziel figures it out. So when you read Uziel's take on Maimonides' treatise, I think he pegged it.
Okay, thank you. We have another question with a quote from the book. Saladin says, "With your help, we are creating a monument to the pursuit of knowledge. What one builder begins, another will finish. In my time, I have met many healers of princes, but you are different. You are the prince of healers." So with respect to your comments, gift of the soul, what is a common ground? And is this where your title comes from?
Yes. I mentioned it right at the beginning, but the fact that it came from Saladin and in that context, I waited till later in the book. Yeah.
Okay. All right. I have one question, and that is, as wonderful and as great, and you call him perhaps one of the greatest Jewish scholars, yet his books were burned, not only by our enemies, but by other Jews. What is it that Maimonides said that so offended so many others who were Jewish at the time to cause Guide for the Perplexed to be burnt?
Some of that comes out in the quasi debate between him and Zuta when the Guide for the Perplexed is launched, if you wish, at his synagogue. And part of it is that God is very impersonal, in the sense that God has no emotions. And remember that Maimonides' philosophy kind of grew out of the philosophy of Aristotle. Greek philosophy kind of had a renaissance in the Middle Ages, and not only Aristotle's philosophy, but also his science. That the earth is the center of the universe and everything revolves around the earth, and that therefore we're the most important thing going. And Maimonides kind of poked holes in that a little bit by saying that God is really so beyond the human sphere that there's very little, if any, interaction between God and humans, that it's really a lower level intellect that interacts with us and not what he would call the Godhead. So that was heretical, right? That God didn't answer prayer, that God didn't listen to us or intervene in history. Also, his view as to why good people suffer is a whole question that he goes into, that the typical rabbinic Jew may not have really liked that much. And so they felt that he was heretical and they burned his books. To this day, in ultra-Orthodox yeshivas, they will study Maimonides' Mishneh Torah, which is his summary of the Talmud, and they will study that. They will not study the Guide for the Perplexed. And the traditional answer given to that is that in between those two books, Maimonides went crazy and lost his mind. And therefore, you don't read Guide for the Perplexed, which is really unfortunate because there's such rich material in there. That having been said, I think that any philosophy, if it's really serious, has its backdrop in kind of the zeitgeist, right? The general philosophy and thinking and science of its time. So the science in Maimonides' time was very static, right? That God was perfect and therefore did not change, did not interact with us at all. The way the universe operated was like a clock that never changed in its movements, a very static view. We're now living in a world of quantum science where things are totally different. And scientists nowadays don't talk about things, they talk about fields. And that it's a totally different way, that the only constant in our world today is change. And so my feeling is that Maimonides is kind of preparing us for that and saying, if you want to do philosophy, you have to know your science and make sure that the two are compatible with each other.
Okay, so thank you. First of all, just a request from several of the participants. They would love to have all those books you listed. If you could somehow put them in the chat or make up a list that perhaps Karen could send out. A lot of people have asked for all the names and authors of the books you've listed. And another question, obviously taking us into modernity, there's a long time tradition of rivalries, sometimes violent, between the different churches that erupt at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and other churches. Why should we expect that Jews and Muslims should not compete for the Temple Mount?
Of course, it's going to happen. But then again, what Maimonides and Ibn Rushd and then later Thomas Aquinas tried to do is to say the only way we're going to get along on this earth is to rise above all those petty differences. And when you come right down to it, they are petty. A lot of them are turf wars and everything else. And that we have to rise above that and see our common humanity. We're still struggling with that today. I think we're doing a good job, certainly in Canada, of trying to develop these interfaith cooperations. I mean, Jenny's group, Heart to Heart, it does annual miracles in this regard, in bringing teenagers from Israel over to over here. They're from Palestinian and Jewish backgrounds, and we need more of that. That's the kind of thing that we need.
Okay, thank you. Now a little bit personal about what his actual family life. Can you talk a little bit more about what actually is known about his family life?
Yeah, he was a big fan of Netflix. I know that. And yeah, I guess his father, the personality I developed of his father was really my invention. You know, he was really stern and demanding. Although I'm imagining as a rabbi, that wouldn't have been far from the truth in the way he raised his children. I think his mother did die when he was fairly young. And however, the character of Esther and her daughter Miriam coming into the house, once again, is fictitious, but I'm sure there must have been some people who were caregivers when he and his brother were young. He loved his brother. The two of them were very, very close. And for those of you who have read the book, you know that a tragedy happens to David later in the book. And Maimonides was depressed for over a year. That is factually true. So, and of course, it probably made him reevaluate some of his thinking. So there were family events that really did affect him very personally.
Okay, thank you. Someone else, you had talked about how the observant community, in many respects, in particular with Guide to the Perplexed, refuses to really allow that to be studied. Could you imagine how Maimonides would make commentary on our observant community today? What would he say to that observant community today?
I think what you mean by observant community are probably the ultra traditionalists, right? The ultra Orthodox in Judaism. I consider myself to be an observant Jew, right? So just to define it a little bit more specifically, I think he would look at them and he would say that you have taken the Torah and turned it into an idol. And that when you do that, you stop worshiping God and you really start worshiping the laws themselves. And when you do that, all of a sudden the laws become frozen and they can't change. And I think he tried to open our minds, but in a very different way in the Middle Ages, but at least open our minds to say that the mitzvot, the laws, serve a purpose. And to the extent that they serve that purpose, perhaps, is how we should observe them. And to him, one of the main purposes of the ritual laws was to maintain social cohesion, to keep society together. If we're all observing the same rites and practices, then it binds us together as a community, right? Which, interestingly enough, the Reconstructionist rabbi Mordechai Kaplan later picked up on in the 20th century and developed it in a different way. He certainly knew his Maimonides.
Thank you. Okay, there are two more questions. One of them, and this one is pretty specific. Chapter 23, Moses returns home. And the questioner says, I thought maybe he had returned to Cordoba, although he was very old and it was difficult. And this chapter was a bit of a curiosity and a mystery to this reader. So any comment on that?
No, when he returned home to his family. I mean, that's what was home for him then. And they were in Fustat, which is a suburb of Cairo. That having been said, this is factually true. Maimonides always signed his letters, Rabbi Moses, son of Maimon from Cordoba.
Okay.
And he always acknowledged his roots back in Spain.
Okay, thank you.
But I think home in that chapter was definitely where his wife and son were.
Okay, and just one last question. This has always been, since many of us have known you, this has been your passion, someone you looked up to. Where do you go from here? The book is done, the book is published. How do you carry on the passion for that mind that you so admire? Is there another book, another possibility? What's next?
Am I allowed to take a break?
A Netflix series.
Yeah, there you go. A Netflix series on Maimonides. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll talk.
Yeah, no, there's some ideas rattling around, but they're still really inchoate to try and tell you now. But thank you for asking.
Okay. So those are all the questions. Let me just see if there is, no, that's it. So thank you so much. I think you've answered them all. And as I said, the list of books is something, the ones you recommended in particular in reference to Guide for the Perplexed. And you have really given us an insight into an amazing mind, both Maimonides and yours, Rabbi Englander. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Arliene. Thank you for hosting so nicely.
Would you share again the slide that shows everyone where to get the book in case people haven't had the opportunity yet?
Sure. Thank you, Rabbi. I was going to type in the titles, and for some reason I couldn't do it. So maybe I can pass them on to Karen. I'm trying to share screen, and it doesn't seem to be allowing me to do that. Am I still co-host?
Yeah.
Oh, there it is. Huh, that little green guy. Okay. So there is... there's a picture of the cover, and it's available either on Amazon.ca or Amazon.com. And those of you who have read it, you're welcome to leave a review on either of those sites as well.
I would say you're encouraged to leave a review. And if you haven't had the opportunity yet to read the book, as you can tell from tonight, you're in for a real treat. It's a really fascinating read, and you'll learn a lot about Maimonides, and you'll enjoy it as well. And perhaps it will take you on some other tangents, as Jenny was talking about, and really help you to connect to some other parts of Jewish history and identity of that time period. So we're so delighted that everyone was able to be here with us this evening to share in this book launch for Rabbi Englander. We particularly are grateful for our partnership this evening with JSpaceCanada, so that we were able to bring this to you along with Solel Congregation of Mississauga. And very, very happy to be partnering with you on this. And thank you so much, Jenny, for being our panelist questioner for tonight, and doing sort of the Q&A with Rabbi Englander. Thank you so much, Larry, as well, for bringing this book to us and giving us really, in many ways, a more nevuchim for our time, a guide for the perplexed today, for understanding not only Maimonides, but also understanding a bit more of our own Jewish identity and connection to the world of that time period, as well as what we think about today and how we understand many things, philosophy, spirituality, all kinds of perspectives And most of all, we want to also thank David Grosskind for helping us with all the tech for tonight, and Karen Mock, of course, with JSpaceCanada. So we're delighted everyone was here. We look forward to further conversations on these and other subjects with you, and thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you, Audrey. Thank you, Audrey and Arliene and Solel congregation. As you can all tell, we belong to a little bit of a mutual admiration society. And of course, to Jenny for her outstanding moderation. Yasher Koach Larry, it's just fantastic to have been able to share this with all of you. And thank you to all of our participants for tuning in. We'll follow up soon with a short survey and a link to the recording, and I can include, Larry will send me the references, and we can include that in our follow-up to all the participants. I would be remiss, though, if I didn't invite you to make a donation, however modest, to JSpaceCanada, if you are so inclined, so that we can continue to bring you these terrific webinars and to partner, again, with Solel, hopefully, and other organizations as well. Stay tuned for our next one next month when we do the Canadian launch of a new book on Muslim-Jewish relations with some of your friends, Larry, from the Canadian Association of Jews and Muslims.
Great.
The book is called We Refuse to Be Enemies. And we'll mention your book again, and we'll circulate the references to it and the link. Be safe and be well, everyone, and we hope to see you again. Good night.
Good night, everybody. Thank you.